example, which I will tell you some more a bit about it, teach us how even the term interfaith or intermarriage is defined as such. Like what we come to think of as intermarriage is governed by the state. So the case study is of grand waves of immigrants who came mostly from the former Russia, Soviet Union, who immigrated to Israel under the very generous and expensive law of return. They were entitled to become fully fledged citizens in Israel, but they are not defined and recognized as Jews by the religious law. So they are in this in-between liminal phase, like continuous phase, where they're Jewish but not really Jewish. Many of them actually are related to like Jewish families. They have a Jewish background. Some of them have had some identity work as Jews, right, in the former Soviet Union. And when they came to Israel, they suddenly became non-Jews. So the state has taken upon itself this undertaking of encouraging, like a really pro-conversion policy to encourage those waves of immigrants to convert to Judaism and become formally Jews. So this kind of anxious policy to encourage, and they don't want it as much, has to do with like battling intermarriage. But this is not a real intermarriage because those non-Jewish Jews are not something else than, they don't know anything else but being something like a Jews. They integrate within Israeli publics. They are part of the nationalist Israeli Jewish fold. So they're not really non-Jews, but they are defined, and the kind of relations that they form with like real proper kosher Jews is defined as intermarriage, as an interfaith. And the other example is from American Jewry context. It's a project that I've been working on for the last 10 years. And there is a really bold anxiety regarding intermarriage. Intermarriage is taken as a marker, as an indicator of demolition of identity, of blurring of identity, blurring of boundaries, and demographic loss, right? People are intermarrying out. So the anxiety is stated out loud, and it's explicated by social scientists, experts, again, like us, who advocate against intermarriage. Intermarriage is depicted as a silent Holocaust. This is where we, the Jews, lose all our numbers. On the other side, intermarriage is taken as a possible gain. Let's bring all those spouses, right, and bring them into the fold. They may become, even if they don't formally convert, they may help the Jewish spouse to create and engage a Jewish family. So there is a whole industry, communal industry, governed by Jewish organizations to boost Jewish identity, to do it so that people will go on birthright trips to go over to Israel and become more proud Jews, and then they make the right choice. Then they will conduct their conduct in a way that will be favorable for the Jewish fold. So this is really good, like I think, example of a governmental exercise of power.
Okay, thank you. That was, really helpful to think about. It is not, interfaith relations don't take place in, when people are asked, right? An imam, a rabbi, and a, priest comes together and they see how you talk to each other. But actually, it happens all the time, every day, and in very intimate spheres as well. Okay, so, we'll have these 3 little sections. So this was the first discussion. And then the second one, we are going to talk about how anthropology of our perspective, Abrahamic religions, I'm an anthropology of Islam, anthropology of Christianity, anthropology of Judaism. Michal will talk a little bit about how our Abrahamic religions of study contributed to study of religion. Do you want to start, Tim?
Yes, very well. I said, if you're quite right, I should use the microphone, please. I've been fiddling around with it. My post in the department from which I'm now retired was in the study of religion in the context of a theology department. It was sort of dealing with one third of the students who wanted to know what actually happened on the ground as opposed to what ought to happen. And of course, when you turn to the study of religion, you're looking at practices rather than norms. I think that's the polite way of putting it. Now, my post in the study of religion looked at, if you like, what various forms of religion does in the world rather than what it is said to be. And hence it escaped from a certain traditional study of religion dealing in secularization, study of decline, focus on constituted groups and things, and looked instead at a range of ethnographic and historical case studies which had arisen since the 1960s, social history and so forth, which provided wonderful materials and a challenge to the adequacy of what one might call materialist approaches, in a way. I mean, it's been a remarkable period if you actually look at the case studies that have emerged in the last 30 years. And it provides a basis of being able to completely really conjure away the traditional questions of the study of religion and look at actually what's happening on the ground in individual people, in individual cases. So now it's worth saying all that is terrific, and it provides endless material for courses. I had to keep, taking only part of the course because there was so much material, and reducing it down and focusing on that repeatedly. But that is not, of course, specific to what CIP was doing, nor is it incompatible with what CIP was doing. But it wasn't the same. So the question is then, secondly, what is missing? And I think the particular case of really what is rarer in the ordinary studies that I'm talking about, what is rarer is engagement with cases of two faiths interacting. It's relatively rare, which of course is only, as we've suggested already, an instance of how religious people interact with the world, but it is a specific cases which are worth studying. I mean, this is the strange. So it always seems to me that as a result of that sort of missing aspect, the business that was exemplified by the summer school and by scriptural reasoning hasn't been fully integrated into the life of an academic faculty. This is something that may come up in the questions for discussion. And it's something we may return to in questions of appropriate methods and so on. But it seems to me it's worth saying, in my view, we had excellent study of religion embodied in myself, and one or two of the people here who studied it with me and so on. And this is drawing on a movement that is present in the wider academy. But at the same time, there are questions about what further or what is more specific that you need in order to, is there, as it were, specific things that interfaith program does? The last thing I want to sort of mention is really the anthropology of Christianity, very specific, associated with the name, for example, of Joel Robbins, who I think is a friend of all of us here. Now, lots of interesting work has been done. In a way, it's almost as if anthropologists discovered that religious groups were almost the last place where normal cultural life was going on. People were being defined by their categories and doing interesting things that anthropologists could go and look at, and so on. The last lively self-differentiating groups in an otherwise homogenizing global society. And what these organizations do, by and large, they don't deal with interactions between faiths. I mean, for perfectly good reasons. If you're doing apprenticeships and doctorates, you shouldn't be dealing in over complex situations. But they look at indigenous values, which is the basis, it seems to me, of good anthropology, and really, again, on the question of what does, in the case of the anthropology of Christianity, what does Christianity offer a group in the modern world? What kind of resources does it bring? What kind of sense does it allow to be made? Why does it make sense to the people who are using it, and so on? Part of that can be a focus on scripture and formation, though, of course, those would then be subgroups. So the anthropology of Christianity is, as it were, a place where work is going on that may contribute to the overall project of the interfaith program. Lastly, as it were, in that context, there has been an embryonic interest in the contribution that theology might make to the history and practice of ethnography and anthropological writing. You know, there's a kind of small movement of anthropology interacting with theology and bringing anthropologists and theologians together. And really, I think what one would say is this is in very early stages. It seems to me that we might talk about it in our third section a bit when it comes to, you know, what sort of methods are brought. It's got traps in it. The main trap that I've identified, of course, is that anthropologists suddenly discover there are things called theological books, and they suddenly think, my goodness, somebody's actually written out longhand what's going on, you know. And of course, it isn't true. Theology is itself, by and large, products of moments of crisis. They're interventions in practical situations. They're precisely, as it were, responses to state movements and so on. So what theologies are, in fact, are historically situated acts of repair and intervention and so on. They're much, much more exciting, really, than, as it were, writing out the rule books. So this is where one of the areas that one has to be quite careful of dealing in, because, of course, you know, good theological texts get perpetuated. They're read sometimes 500 years or 1,000 years after they're being written. And of course, they look as if they're rule books, if you see what I mean. So that is just one thing to say about the anthropology of Christianity. So there are, as it were, three things going on, it seems to me. There is a study of religion, which I think can be made extremely exciting. There is, as it were, something that we need to ask about whether an interfaith program has something different or more to add to that, or an emphasis to pursue. And there are some really excellent things going on in the anthropology of Christianity in various forms, which also are to be interacted, but not to be confused with either of the previous two.
Okay, thank you. So Michal, what does anthropology of Judaism has contributed to our understanding of study of religion? How do you see the genealogy or?
Okay, so for a long time, anthropology didn't really have any explicit interest in Judaism and Jewish life, which is actually kind of weird given that so many of the fathers, it's usually fathers and not mothers, right, of anthropology have been coming from Jewish background. Anthropology has marginalized, Jewish life in terms of its focus of interest, to the extent that Virginia Dominguez has once asked whether anthropology has a Jewish problem in itself. For the last 20, 30 years or so, there is no Jewish problem in anthropology. The anthropology of Jewish life and within it of anthropology of Judaism is vibrant, is bubbling, is teeming, precisely because Jewish life is bubbling and teeming in so many new and renewed ways that grab the attention. Oh, I'm not very good. Maybe I will take this one as well. Fine. That grab the attention of anthropologists. So I will just mention two things, two kind of directions or kind of dynamics that grab the attention. One is the fact that, what we may call Jewish land, where people do Jewish stuff, any kind of Jewish stuff, is not done by Jews or by people who may be defined, strictly defined, Jewishly defined by the Jewish law as Jews. Across the globe and very much in the global south, different groups claim different kinds of belonging and relatedness to Jewish life and to Judaism. Abba Yudaya in Uganda, Delemba in South Africa, Jews by choice, daughters and sons of Noah. All kinds of really different experimentation with Jewish relatedness, and usually it is exercised by a kind of interfaith encounter between groups from the mainstream of Jewish life, who are very much interested in and invested in a way, missionizing any kind of Jewish relatedness. So this kind of Jewish land is diversified, and I think that it teaches us how religion is mobilized and sometimes instrumentalized in order to claim and negotiate belongings, like other kind of belonging. My second point is that the word experiment that I just used is very much relevant for what happens clearly within Jewish life. Like even Jewish orthodoxy, which claims itself and asserts itself to be based on a long-term tradition, right, unchanging, right? This is part of the very definition of orthodoxy, is inventing itself all the time. It is spatialized. If you go to Jerusalem, if you go to Hebron, you see how it is politicized and spatialized. Settlers in Hebron believe that they live and act and do theology just by living there and claiming their, presence in this particular city. Different kind of intersections and synthesis between orthodoxy and New Age. So, like, Jewish life is so inventive and resourceful, and the way that people engage with it is so creative that I think that what the anthropology of Jewish life and Judaism teach us is how religion is all the time a work in progress and a kind of labor that is exercised in order to continue and to pretend as if we just do, as our fathers have used to, but by inventing it.
Okay, thank you. This is really interesting to look at, how study of these three religions have evolved. So unlike Christianity and Judaism, which became later interests in anthropology, Islam has been a focus of interest from the very beginning. So lots of founding fathers of anthropology, from Evans Pritchard to Ernest Gellner to Clifford Geertz, have written about anthropology of Islam. So I guess we can speculate, right, in relation to Christianity, right? Anthropology has been the study of others, so people felt, maybe Christianity is too familiar. With Judaism, again, we can speculate many other reasons, where imaginary of Jewishness and Judaism has been, especially since the Second World War. So that's another thing. But anyway, so Islam, I think, has been imagined as the religion. So I'm hesitating a little bit because Judaism is also as the religion, but yeah. But in a way, Islam is this, maybe in relation to Christianity, right? Muslims are the ones who have the religion and Christians are the normal ones. They're just like bland ones. So I think that is that led to the later discovery of Christianity by anthropologists. So in a way, anthropology of Islam, I think, has shaped the way we understand how we study religion. So, and also from the beginning, the anthropology of Islam approached Islam as a set of interpretive resources and practices. So from the very beginning, anthropologists had to take theology and also writing very seriously because Muslims take it so seriously, right? You couldn't avoid it. You go to, very humble house, a mud floor somewhere, you will see that the Quran is sitting at a high place, or people are, reading Quranic verses to a water and drinks it for healing, right? So it was, it was impossible to avoid writing from the beginning. And also, again, from the beginning, anthropologists had two different approaches. One came from Clifford Geertz's approach. He looked at Morocco and Java, looked at how Islam is practiced in these two different places. And his approach was that, let's say none is Saudi Arabia, right? None is the central place. Both are kind of different variations. And he saw it as, as just you were saying, how do local people find meaning in Islam in shaping their own lives? So he kind of put culture at the center in understanding. So culture gives a way for people to relate to the religion. So there is no a more, let's say, both a fundamentalist and sometimes a theological, more traditional theological approach might be religion is when you take culture out. You go to Morocco, you take the weird cultural practices out, and then the pure thing that remains is religion. So Clifford Geertz told us it is not like that, because we can never take culture out. We cannot survive without culture. You couldn't have said, yeah, it is like saying, oh, humans, if they didn't have their bodies, that is what their intellect would be, right? It is, embodied. And then we had Talal Asad, really has been influential in our understanding of anthropology of Islam and religion in general. So he focused on powerful religious figures who authorize some interpretations of the Islamic tradition and suppress others. Just like you were saying too, how states and other actors are very involved in saying this is how it should be, this is right, this is wrong. So instead of focusing on culture, Talal Asad said, let's focus on politics, because it is a struggle in which what religion should be and how it is practices is shaped. Yeah, so I would say these are the things that anthropology of Islam have brought. Okay, so we're moving. Okay, we already took a lot of more time than we imagined, which usually happens. But now let's briefly talk about methodology, because many people also take ethnography as the defining and the main thing what anthropology is, right? They say, oh, you go and live with people, right? I guess we would agree that it is a small part. This is our methodology, but also has a philosophical approach. Also, what makes anthropology anthropology? Maybe if we can briefly talk a little bit about, from your perspective, Michal, what is methods of anthropology and how can that contribute to understanding of interfaith?
Sure, and I will talk briefly. So methods is a small word, I think, to define what is such an essence. Actually, for my own, Actually, for my own choice to become an ethnographer, like I chose to become an anthropologist because I wanted to become an ethnographer. I first studied psychology, and then I understood that I can encounter people in fieldwork, right? Which this is what we are doing. So I will just point at two thoughts that I have about methods and interfaith. One is that, or about religion more generally. Like fieldwork, participant observation allows me to study not only religion, but to study religious people. And the difference is not semantic alone. It's a real difference. If I focus on religious people, so I follow them or befriend them not only when they do religion, not only the immediate spaces of worship, I follow them whatever they do as religious people, when they do their domestic stuff, when they do friendship. I follow them when they do their activism, right? Their morality. For the last 5 years, I've been working on what can be maybe tagged as a Haredi, meaning ultra-Orthodox Me Too, a movement in Israel and abroad, activists and professionals who advocate, who fight against sexual abuse in all its instances. And when they do it as Haredi people, both men and women, they do it as Haredi people. But even if they don't do religion at a time that they do activism, but they do their activism as religious people. They speak and act in the name of God. When they critique their leaders, their rabbis, their communal leaders, they do it in the name of God. When they try to remake morality that went wrong, they think went wrong, and they right, they do it in the name of. For them, it's a matter of worship, like bettering the world in terms of fighting sexual violence is almost a religious act. So I think that fieldwork allows me this more expensive scheme or understanding. The second thing, and I will be really brief, is that I think that because usually we anthropologists study religious people and we are usually secular, feminist, liberal. So in a way, our encounter with our interlocutors is a kind of interfaith encounter, right? That really stress us to check our liberalism, the limits of liberalism. It's a kind of exercise in tolerance. And I think that it's not only an exercise in tolerance for me, but for them as well. And this kind of encounter is telling, because I'm not interested in myself, I'm interested in them. So whatever they project on me in this encounter, I learn so much about them. So whenever I studied Lubavitcher Hasidism, and they tried all the time to missionize me to become an ultra-Orthodox Jew, I learned so much from this exercise. Or for example, those state agents that I mentioned before that tried to embrace the newcomers from the former Soviet Union, when they treated me as a Zionist, religious, secular Jew, but I'm Zionist. They assumed I am, right? That I'm a proper Zionist Jew, so I'm part of the national mission. So for them, like, it made me understand how much the national component is critical to their religious endeavor. So,
excellent. Thank you. Do you want to say a few words?
Right, thank you. I mean, really, I just want to expand a bit on what Michal has said, from the point of view of a theology faculty, in a sense. It seems to me that really both of us have used anthropology to expand beyond the confines of the difficult topic of religion, as such, and without losing sight of the values and powers and continuities contained in religious commitments. And that's really kind of where we balance, isn't it? Because it's very possible as an anthropologist, I say, to be rather dismissive of those things. And that is the thread along which particularly an anthropologist has to walk. And as I've suggested already, that comes down to studying what resources religiously committed groups bring to engagements with the modern world, in a way, isn't it? It's part of what they've got in their what they bring with them. And of course, actually, I mean, just to interpose a personal note, my own study is of relations of what you might call spirit life to high tech. I'm sort of interested in, as it were, where strangely, ideas that we don't regard as scientific appear in high-tech productivity. So now I've also suggested that as a second and sub-theme, realizing that theologies are largely produced in specific contexts in response to crises and so on is really quite important. They are acts of repair with, they're not a worldview, if you like. And so they're interventions. And of course, CIP and interfaith and so on has to be seen as an intervention of a certain kind in a certain context and adapting to changing situations. Now, in CIP, we used a course marker, really, to try and define what we were doing that was perhaps, as it were, our unique selling point within the interfaith world. And it was what we call no fourth position. It wasn't the business that we were trying to find something outside the commitments of the people we were dealing in order to kind of take a triangulation point and decide, what were unacceptable or minor practices and what were, as it were, acceptable common life, which all sensible people could agree with. It's very different to finding basic ground rules which allow you to interact with each other. Interesting. So no fourth position was, as it were, something we always kept at the back of our mind. And there is a genuine difficulty here, and this is where I think theology departments are quite interesting. There is a genuine difficulty because, of course, we too are human beings with ethical commitments and so on. And we really, you can get some way trying to understand, for example, what the purposes of fundamentalism are and how they have positive effects and how they create positive worldview for the people involved. And the prosperity gospel is a relatively easy one where anthropologists were first repelled and now have a greater understanding of what is going on. But there are still questions about, the employment of gender differences, sexual practices, inequality in the treatment of resources and things where it's not altogether clear that it's all right just to say, well, do as you do. We don't torture these people, but you do. This kind of thing is actually genuinely an issue. So really my thought about theology and its contribution might be, the question is, well, what are the ethical resources that are needed for, first of all, emphasizing the importance of religious commitments, and secondly, not passively supporting what we regard as genuine evils. And this is the line that theologians, I think, tread probably. And in anthropology, it seems to me this is a question of method as much as ethics, if you like. And it seems to me there are some interesting answers when anthropologists begin to borrow from theologians, which kind of bring you onto this line. And of course, one of the questions is, what is sin? I speak as a Christian theologian in this. The question about, beyond the anthropological commitment to comprehension, there is always a question about, do things actually go wrong? Do human beings achieve less than they could do, as it were, as a group? And as it were, what are the indigenous resources for that? So that's really quite an important question, which I see just occasionally surfaces in anthropology, but not for long. And speaking as an anthropologist, I'm just interested in finding out what people do. So there are some real questions, and of course, part of you get a committed anthropology, but that's not much help either, I think. So the question is sort of, what is sin? How do we account for it? And the countervailing thing, which I find useful in my own work, is what is conscience? What are acts undertaken against our inclinations, as collective resources? And it seems to me that again is something, these are things that theologians have thought about quite a lot. They have quite a lot of materials on those kind of questions, which keep surfacing in the social sciences, but the social sciences' usual dealing with them is extraordinarily crude. Normally speaking, you say, well, a modern person thinks like this, and the rest are just fallen creatures, and so on. And that's really no good, as it were. So I think there are some quite interesting things about resources that have been found for what are anthropological problems.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I will just say something very little. Again, ethnography and interfaith. I mean, I guess when we take people seriously, interfaith inevitably comes up, because people, religious people, non-religious people, are always thinking about other belief groups. Like, right? We are the ones who believe this, and we are not like others. We are the ones who act like this. We are not like others. So there is not even a moment in which the other groups are not present, even in an imaginary. There is no, homogeneous religious group. And even if you find it, they are thinking about others, in their minds. So it is always present. Okay, so this is our, 2 cents, 6 cents total. So any questions, any comments are welcome.
So because our panel are using a microphone, we have just one microphone. So I encourage you to put your hands up really high, and our wonderful technician is going to move around with the microphone. While we make that happen, apologies to anyone watching online who missed the first 15 minutes or so. That was a technical error that was caused by me not pressing a very important button.
Somebody has to break the ice.
Yes.
I will. Thank you so much. Oh, hi, everybody. I'm Safet. I teach anthropology of religion here in the faculty, and I work with CIP for a number of years. I've very much enjoyed this conversation. It's kind of bringing in the everyday lives and governmentality, and it's kind of, even as Esra said, in this kind of solitary moment, the other that's always present. I'm wondering, in terms of CIP, specifically, to what extent then, beyond this kind of trinity that's represented in this conversation today, can we travel? And particularly in relation to secularism, because we sort of returned to religion, but can we now kind of return to, because I think it was Hussein Agrama who describes religion and secularism as these two hands of Escher sort of simultaneously drawing each other. And so can CIP then afford to kind of, to perhaps leave that out of the equation, or do we have to return to secularism? And I know Esra has done work on secularism in Turkey, so perhaps this is for you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
A great question, and great thing for all of us to think about. Many people, I'm not the first one to argue that But many people have shown that secularism already comes out of Christianity. So secularism is also Abrahamic, right? So they are these, three groups and their subdivisions. They are always, variations. You can say Islam and Christianity are, I don't know, Jewish movements, Jewish reform movements, right? They are all connected to each other, and secularism is yet another iteration of the same kinds of thinking. And in the geographies that I have worked, these three religions have been quite dominant. So as an anthropologist, I never worked in a place where Buddhism or Hinduism or like some other religions that are studied in our department has been represented. There are in the Middle East, of course, there are other religions, but they are also connected, like Manichaeism, things like that. They are all like part of the same family. So so I think there is space, and in the Indian subcontinent, there are all these connections, and I wish Ankur Baura was here. He shows us these intersection points of Hinduism and Islam. So I think it will be great if we open up space, but I'm worried I will not be the right person because I don't know the tools to think about outside of Abrahamic religions, including secularism. And if you have any pointers to guide us, we're more than happy to follow. Please.
Hi, David Ford. Tim, you said early on that you let the material set the terms, and I'm really intrigued. All three of you, you've all done detailed field work. Yours the only one I know in any thorough way in France and in this country, Tim. But if you were reflecting on how your concepts and your basic terms, the things you think with yourself, have been affected by the material you've actually studied. What have you really learned that's been really important that, before you went into the thing, you didn't understand this. Afterwards, you really, find that the material has set the terms for you, and you've learned something that's been really important and can share with us now. What might that be?
Shall I take? One of the basic truths of going to do field work is, of course, you set out with a theoretical problem that you have identified, and usually speaking, it disappears. And you find yourself studying something completely different. So in that sort of way, all of us have been shaped intellectually, publishing-wise, and everything else by very, very different, the actual realities of the situation one meets. In questions of, I even wrote an article on this once called Fieldwork and the Perception of Everyday Life. And the business about, of course, you only actually learn when you think you understood something and you realize that you didn't. So actually, the material of one's learning, I'm sorry to say, are humiliations and, mistakes and so on. And the whole notion of, if you talk to a person and say, well, how did the field work go? And they say, well, it's marvelous, just sort of, etc. You realize they haven't learned anything, and so gradually, as it were, it is the constitution and changes in yourself which you learn to reflect upon in the end. And so that actually, it's not, of course, possible to state what the changes are, though perhaps people around you might, because, of course, these are the things that you have learned to think because of the experience you've had. It is a remarkable process of being made, collaboratively by the people you've gone among, if you see what I mean. And so it is an apprenticeship in that sort of way, I think. And I think that's partly why field work is a very important experience, particularly in the lives of young people. They are sort of absolutely changed by it. And I say, if they actually come back simply with a thesis on the first thing they thought they'd go and look at, too bad.
I think that the most important lesson for me being a field walking is to continually be a modest and humble, trying to be a modest and humble person. You know, we in academia, we are not, disciplined to become modest people, right? We write our CVs and we all the time need to impress others, right? We're all smart, right? And we know so much, and fieldwork is marvelous. But I think that fieldwork captures you to the ground in a very human sense of really not knowing where you're heading for a long time. It's like, you have this elevator talk, right? And sometimes I'm in fieldwork for like 2-3 years and I'm still not sure where I'm heading. So this is actually a lesson for life and for scholarly life, meaning like you all the time know that you know as much and you really need to explore much more. And in each of my fieldwork, and by now I have had like 4, I all the time arrived at different places. Like even when I mentioned that I'm a political ethnographer, I was not a political ethnographer. I was not even as much a political citizen as much as I should have been. And ethnography made me become so. So in each of my fieldworks, I arrived at new terms. Yes, they are theoretical terms. For the last year or so, I've been writing about language. I've never written about language, but because my ultra-Orthodox interlocutors give a great deal and sensitivity to how they speak about sexual violence. So I need now to study following them language, although I'm not a linguistic anthropologist. So in each of my fieldwork, I set new terms that I didn't envision, right? And I know all the time that fieldwork is not marvelous. It's really a mess. It's a real mess.
Okay. So it opens up a door in psychologizing anthropologists. But I think there is this, anthropologists are people either escaping themselves and wanting to learn about others, or they cannot figure out how their own society works, so often you will encounter people a little awkward. And I think when they're in an elsewhere, I think their awkwardness becomes, oh, this person is awkward because, they are not from here, so it becomes normalized. But overall, I think we are often people not wanting to engage with others, maybe as a way to escape ourselves. But when it happens, when you go to fieldwork and you ask people all these questions, they respond and they ask you all these questions. And how can you expect honesty from them and then not give that honesty? So I'm very interested in religious people who have a strong sense of spirituality, but I don't have it that deep myself. I have a little bit, but it is pretty shallow. And then people would keep asking me, so what do you think is your purpose? So what is going to happen? Did you think, what's going to happen to you when you die? I was like, after a while, fanning myself, can we turn it to you again? Maybe you will tell me. So that is, you always have to kind of open yourself and also find things about yourself that you didn't know before. Suhail?
Thank you very much and good morning. My name is Suhail Nakhoda. I moved to the Middle East in the year 2000 from the UK. And my work has all these years involved both building the capacity in theology for my own community, the Muslim community, and helping them to, I guess, engage with the modern world. And at the same time, dealing with the political, upheavals that have happened during the last 20 years with the wars and the development of ideological groups and so on. But perhaps I actually welcome more anthropologists in the study of religion of the Middle East, because I think that for the last 20, 30 years, we've suffered, partly because departments of Middle Eastern history and religion have, when studying the Middle East, have focused exclusively perhaps on political movements and a particular strain of political movement, a modern version of political movement that's tied to ideology. But when you encounter people in the Middle East, throughout Middle East, North Africa, what we call MENA, There is a space of religion, and there's a space of politics, and there's a political action that every individual undertakes. But it's not necessarily all religious. Everyone's affected by inflation, by lack of democracy, by voting, by and so on, by policy. But they are not necessarily always understood religiously, unlike is understood in Western, academic centers where they see the whole enterprise of religion and politics as one conundrum. And I think that often religiosity in these cultures, which you do see when a specialist engaged in anthropology or ethnography, is that it's tied more to spirituality, to a long tradition of where theology, spirituality, culture, and life were fused together in the same way the Geertz, for example, found it in Indonesia, or we found it from Morocco all the way, to Indonesia. And that has been very missing. And sometimes when that expertise is missing, and then what translates to information or advice or policy in the way that Western governments approach the Muslim world, understand how and what is happening in the Middle East, I think things go wrong. And so I hope that there's more of this happening, more sensitivity to Bedouins, to locals, to Sufi groups, to ordinary people, to how religion was passed down to them, and not simply looking at the Marvel reformers of the, XYZ that happened in the 70s onwards as being the defining character of how religion is practiced by the common man and woman in the streets in Tunis, in Algiers, in Amman, in Abu Dhabi, in Cairo, so ever. And I think everyone will be a lot richer for it. Anyway, thank you. I gained a lot from today's presentation.
We accept you to our tribe.
Yeah. Thank you, Sohail.
Thank you very much. Ben Quash, Tim's co-author. I'm interested in the question of what deep presupposition underlies what I take to be the anthropologist's assumption that humans are intelligible to each other across very significant historical distances and cultural divides. As a theologian, my instinct would always be to turn to theological categories to account for the intelligibility of humans to each other, the fact that there is a thing called humanity, perhaps. But if that is a premise, and maybe you'll tell me that it isn't, or it isn't a necessary premise for anthropology to proceed, but if it is, where can it be derived on it, if not from a sort of theology or something theology-like? And perhaps as a little rider to that question, how does that fit with Tim's interrogation and critical dismantling of the natural law tradition, if that were to be an alternative, which clearly it isn't for Tim? So, where else might one look?
I think the question of, as it were, intelligibility and mutual transparency is often overrated, and much of this is one of the reasons why people are uncomfortable, I think, with some of the inheritance of Clifford Geertz. That sort of, it's all very well to pose culture, but actually, the culture we share is it's quite limited. And one of the things that I've been interested in for a long time is what I call mutual misunderstanding, and the business that human acts are not, as it were, mutually transparent. When talking to scientists, I say, you're married, you bring up children together with your wife, or your husband, do you have a common view of what the project is? And they say, my goodness me, no. But nevertheless, the children are sort of brought up somehow, feral or Catholic or whatever it is. And both, so human beings use language, for example, to collaborate in certain sorts of ways, even if there are not fully shared meanings. And there is forms of cooperation. And I think a lot of what we deal in precisely as interactions between groups work at what are called boundaries and so on, questions about, whatever a government is, you know, how you interact with it and so on, these kind of questions. So I think, you know, as always, the humanities rather dodge the questions that theologians raise. But I think we're not that worried about the present lot, as it were, are not that worried about questions of intelligibility at a high level, if you like. Of course, I mean, lots of groups are. A lot of the groups we deal in are, and they precisely usually, you know, jump from, as it were, the individual and the individual's mind to some kind of cosmic level, thus missing out all the intermediate scales at which human beings collectively make sense or a mess of things together. So it's in that kind of intermediate area that I think we look for questions of the very limited intelligibility, which of course this meeting may be an example of.
Okay. Oh, Ben, you asked an excellent question, and it is, a huge question. So I'll just try to chew on from a tiny little corner. The anthropological tradition that I have been trained in is the American one. And what shaped it is kind of 1950s, post-Second World War, having defeated the Nazis. And anthropology and the common understanding of humans is a statement against racism. A common statement that at some level, we are the same, right? You know, that can be criticized, whatnot, but, you know, as a theological statement, maybe anthropology as an answer to a crisis. And also then the field has also shaped itself, understanding this human species from all directions. We are going to study it archaeologically, we are going to look at its bone structures, how it stood up. And I guess I am shaped in that, you know, despite our differences, you know, we all stay 9 months in our mother's wombs, that we all are born, you know, this helplessly, and then we walk upright. That walking upright brings us a lot of backaches when you pass your 40s, right? You know, there are these tons of common things, our perception, right? We cannot see the back, we can only see the front. You know, our voice projects this much. So all of those physical things are our common limitations, and then which then form the basis of being able to put ourselves in each other's positions at some level. Even if it is just at a physical level, right? This person who's from totally different culture, whatever, he also, his toenails grow in the same speed as mine. You know, so at that level, I feel like we can relate to each other and partly understand each other, would be my position. Do you want to say anything?
I just want to follow Tim and say, you know, I'm not a big fan of translation. This idea that, like, you know, translation is like, I problematize the very notion of translation, not only in ethnography, right? So, but it pertains also to ethnography. I think that, you know, if we do what Tim and Esra has just said, and we do it in a very methodological way for a long time, the messiness that I was talking about before, you know, it has some clarity over time. Like the accumulated messiness brings some insight a long time. And it also brings, maybe friendship is too big a word, but it brings trust and rapport. Like if I don't manage to establish trust with my interlocutors, I would fail. And whenever I failed to do it, I failed in my fieldwork. So this is the basic way for like any engagement with empathy and so on. And I think that like this humanist project of ethnography in general is all the more important when we see populism rising around us, you know, in Israel, it's over there. So for me, even as a teacher, speaking to my students, they're younger, like in 25 years from me, their reality is based off what they know about Netanyahu, right? This is their leader for the last, like they have grown up in this kind of political reality. For me, speaking about them, about this kind of human project and breaking the taken for granted ways of thinking is a clear, like, political statement that, like, its importance is not only in terms of like my scholarly interest, but in terms of just being, citizens and human beings.
Thank you, everybody, for such a fascinating discussion. Sarah Snyder here, and I want to ask, picking up on some of the last conversation about the anthropology across disagreement, where there is an inability to find the imagination to step into the shoes of the other, or whether that act is in itself impossible for various social reasons or psychological reasons, betrayal, etc. And whether any of you have had any experience of that that you can share with us briefly.
You're asking us to, these pivot points of exactly. It's not exactly what you ask, but sometimes people you want to talk to don't allow you to do that work, and they reject you outright. So that happened to me. For example, I was doing work with some Turkish student groups in Germany. And nowadays, of course, everything is on the internet. So they Googled me, and then they found statements of me that they didn't think are nationalist enough. So then they said, yeah, we're embarrassed of you. Like, what kind of a Turk you are that you would say things that, are not so flattering to your country. So then they said, yeah, then we are not going to allow you to try to understand us. And until that moment, they were so proud of me. Oh, you're a Turkish professor. They were trying to identify with me, but that brought a rupture. Oh, you're ideologically different from us, so we're not going to allow this mutual understanding. And when they don't do that, there's not much you can do. Like, this reciprocal thing has to happen for understanding.
I have only limited experiences, but it does seem to me that when you're a relatively young person doing field work, normally the relationship is one of apprentice to people to teach you. And so you're not in a position where people are assessing, whether or not you're sort of suitably qualified or whether your past, allows you to be a person they can trust and so on. They basically take you on and teach you. And there are plenty of people who don't. I mean, one's certainly shaped by the people who invest in you in the field. And I mean, again, you learn quite a lot about the people who are just making do and the people who have a certain sort of generosity and the leaders and that kind of thing. You're very pushed in certain directions in a society. But I think the the question of, as it were, coming as an older person, the nature of the inquiry and things is very different. And I think that's actually very important. And that the argument, therefore, would be, if you want to establish trust, send young people who need to learn, who want to learn. As it were.
I'll just say in general that I think that the failure in producing empathy is a failure of fieldwork. So whenever I failed, like, I have my own positions and dispositions, right, as a human being. So when I'm coming to study converts who happen to be usually young women or not so much into religion, my heart is naturally more open to them than to right-wing nationalists, state agents who are really on the other side in terms of, our politics. So I have to work so hard in order to produce this empathy. And sometimes I do, and I benefit, and sometimes it didn't work. But sometimes, it may even go back to Ben's question from before. They, as human beings, are so much more round as characters and interesting than I could have ever imagined in my own stereotypes, in my own culture, that they make it easier for me to have this empathy. Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah, I have seen that gentleman, and then you can ask the last question.
Thank you very much. My name's Dominic White. At the moment, I'm working on the issue of resistance of liturgical reform in the Catholic Church. So, and I'm doing that both as a theologian and as a pastor, priest. So the church hierarchy decides to change the way public worship happens. Some people don't like it and they resist. And I'm wondering, given you've worked on interfaith dialogue, if not so much common ground, but have you found any common tendencies between people about what they will accept in change of worship and what they won't? I don't know if that's a fair question or too big a one, but I really am curious if you can tell me anything about that. Thank you.
Well, I feel like none of us on this table do interfaith dialogue. Probably Sarah or, may give a better answer. Like we all look at places where, or, maybe me and Michal, different religious groups come together and how they engage with each other. But I never worked on interfaith dialogue. I am fascinated by it.
Thinking interfaith dialogue, but do you notice tendencies just among the people you work with? Maybe the tension even within their own communities? Or if there are common tendencies to say, we don't like what either the imam or the priest or the rabbi has proposed or whatever. Does that ever surface? Maybe not.
I think, again, it's a difficult question to anthropologists because we're obsessed with specificity of our situations.
And people have different ideas of specificities of truth, right? And their tolerance of truth.
My microphone.
Sorry. So.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I mean, you asked us a difficult question.
Sorry.
Okay. Daniel.
Thanks, Daniel Weiss. Thanks, Daniel Weiss. My question is, do you feel that ethnographers are well placed to understand interreligious relations better than, say, other academic disciplines? Specifically in terms of your experiential aspects, the fact of when an ethnographer goes to a community, there's that they're embodying that aspect of trying to understand someone who's different, even if it's not specifically framed as interfaith between the ethnographer and the community. But just that sense of that aspect of the inter element and trying to understand across. So even if you're not studying interfaith dialogue, and you feel that your experience as an ethnographer puts you in a position to have insights into the way in which different groups could relate to or understand one another.
Yeah.
So I think that ethnography is all about intersubjective experience, right? So we are within this realm. I think, I don't want to compare, although we are the best, right? Like ethnographers, but, I cannot say about others, but I think that we are well placed to understand. And also because we don't take the term dialogue in its proper sense. We don't only see how people talk about this inter space, but how they enact and do it in everyday life. And the kind of thing that they, are frustrated with or are happy with. So given our methods of walking slowly in this messy interspace, I feel that we are okay.
I think anthropology is based on a method which, as it has a model of society in it, in many ways we exemplify what we believe to be the basic social process of, we are changed by interacting with people. So in that sort of way, it isn't voluntary, and similarly, as it were, small groups or large groups are actually changed in their boundaries and what they perceive by the things they interact with. And as it were, they may not reflect on it as much as anthropologists do, but the same processes that at work, aren't they? I mean, that's why we do field work. We think it's basically how human beings interact, and we're kind of using that as a way of trying to understand. And so the fact that, for example, the most obdurate groups are in fact altered and they modernize. For what traditionalist groups, for example, are utterly modern, they have to be reconstituted in every generation. and so on. So they continually absorb, as it were, aspects of the world they're in, and they're utterly different to their traditionalist fathers or mothers or whatever. These kind of processes that are, if you like, unconscious, but just necessary to how human beings, live collectively. And so I think the answer is, the reason why ethnography is productive, I think, is based on that kind of assumption, and it can give you some insights into how religious groups, even ones that you don't find acceptable, work and change and respond to the modern world and live in it positively, as it were. Yeah.
So maybe one point about where anthropology may fail. Because we take the people that we're working with so seriously and we try to understand how they view the world, then you may be a bit misguided by them. For example, in the 21st century, you go to the Middle East or in Europe, you study Jewish-Muslim relations, and then you get the impression that these groups are really different from each other. They really don't like each other. If the people you're working with has this perspective. But a longer historical perspective would give you a totally different sense. So a best one would be an approach that brings together anthropology and history that allows you to look at it vertically and horizontally. Okay.
I think it is now time that we need to show our appreciation for our fantastic panelists for getting us going at this anniversary series. So. And to reassure our online audience that we will be back online at 4:30 p.m. British time as planned. So we will say goodbye for now to our online audience. For those here in the space, some practical, useful information briefly. We are back in this space at 2:00 if you're staying for the scriptural reasoning. However, don't settle too much, because after a short collective introduction, you'll be going off into different spaces, because scriptural reasoning is an activity and a workshop. So back in here at 2:00. We're not providing lunch because we thought it'd be good to get some fresh air and ventilation in these post-pandemic times. But there are opportunities, and if you see people who have a slightly yellow badge like mine, that tends to mean that we can point you in